And you're live.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for this session as part of Scholar Strike 2022. I'm so excited to moderate this session. My name is Harsha. I use she, her pronouns. I'm joining you from the unceded territories of the Coast Salish peoples, the lands of the Musqueam, the Tsleil-Waututh, and the Squamish nations, who continue to assert their jurisdiction and their laws and their sovereignty on these lands. And in the context of speaking in conversation today about thinking about borders, the session is on no walls, no cages, no borders, or perhaps no cages, no walls, no borders, basically down with them all. It's so vital to be thinking through the ways in which borders are such a key part of settler colonial technologies and governance, and that borders have divided Indigenous nations across these lands, including those that we're speaking to you from today. I'm so excited to be in conversation with Sohail and Petra and Todd. I wanted to let you all know that unfortunately Robyn is unable to join us. She had to cancel her 2 sessions today. She's not feeling well, and so we send her so much care and love and best wishes. But we are excited for this conversation today. For all of you who are unfamiliar with Scholar Strike, just briefly, Scholar Strike began in 2020. And continues today in 2021 and 2022 as 2 days of teach-ins by scholars, activists, artists, and students. There's also a day of action and led and started really by Beverly Bain. And so we're so thankful to her for convening all of us. And this year's theme is defund, demilitarize, and abolish police, prisons, and all forms of carcerality. And really thinking about, of course, on this anniversary of March 21st, which is the International Day for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, to commemorate the immense violence of the South African apartheid regime and the Sharpeville massacre of 1960. And so we convene together to think about these continuities of violence and structural racism that continue to be part of our lives, and specifically the ways in which the border is part of that violence. And we see that unfolding in so many different ways, of course, right now, really heightened at the borders of Fortress Europe. Petra is currently speaking to us from within Fortress Europe and has been at so many different border sites. So we're really thrilled to be learning and hearing from you today. Petra, Todd is joining us from the so-called United States and has been thinking about and writing about the many forms of violence, both at the southern US border, the southern US-Mexico border, the maritime border with the Caribbean, and also the mass empire of bordering, the ways in which borders are externalized. And Sohail, who joins us from Algonquin territories, Algonquin and Anishinaabe territories in so-called Ottawa, who's been doing so much incredible work, both their personal experiences as someone who is criminalized and illegalized, as they say, and really doing so much frontline work with incarcerated people in prisons, on the streets, in detention centers. And so we're so excited to start this conversation. Just a few housekeeping pieces for anyone who would like to access captioning. There is live captioning that is happening. Thank you to Scholar Strike for all of the logistics for that. Rajan is holding down tech. Thank you so much to Rajan for that work. And Ian has just done so much work bringing all of us together for this specific panel. So thank you to Ian for that as well. So I will just briefly read the bios for Sohail and Petra and Todd. The way this conversation is going to go is they're each going to speak for about 7 to 10 minutes. We have a little bit more time. And then we're going to do a roundtable with some questions and conversation with each of them. So I'm going to just pull out their bios, which I had and has now closed on the screen. So I'm going to start with Sohail. Sorry, my screen has closed. So Sohail is a non-binary, queer, illegalized, criminalized migrant and former prisoner who is currently living on occupied, unceded, and unsurrendered Algonquin Anishinaabe territory, where they await an imminent deportation to so-called Morocco. Sohail became involved in abolitionist as well as prisoner and migrant justice organizing as they were released from the penitentiary and immigration detention in March 2018 as a member of the Criminalization and Punishment Education Project, a member of the Ottawa Sanctuary Network, and an organizer with the Jail Accountability and Information Jail Hotline. Sohail organizes with incarcerated comrades and is also involved in police abolition organizing, mutual aid, and other projects and sites of resistance on Algonquin Anishinaabe territory as a guest and displaced human. Next, we'll have Petra Molnar, who is a lawyer and anthropologist and the Associate Director of the Refugee Law Lab, York University. Her current work focuses on the impacts of surveillance technologies on people crossing borders and splits her time between Canada and Greece. She's currently working on her first book, Artificial Borders, AI, Surveillance, and Border Tech Experiments, coming out in 2022. And then we have Todd Miller, who writes a weekly post for the Border Chronicle. He has researched and written about border issues for more than 15 years, the last 8 as an independent journalist and writer. He resides in Tucson, Arizona, but also has spent many years living and working in Oaxaca, Mexico. His work has appeared in the New York Times, Tom Dispatch, The Nation, San Francisco Chronicle, In These Times, Guernica, and Al Jazeera English, among other places. Miller has authored 4 books: Build Bridges, Not Walls, A Journey to a World Without Borders; Empire of Borders, The Expansion of the US Border Around the World; Storming the Wall, Climate Change, Migration, and Homeland Security; and Border Patrol Nation Dispatches from the Front Lines of Homeland Security. So if we can start our first conversation, and really, if you all can lead us in conversation about what role do detention centers and borders play within the broader interconnected struggle against white supremacy, empire, carceral containment, and all of that, and the ways in which you see the fight to abolish borders as integral to abolitionist practices of care, safety, world-making, and liberation. So I'll turn it over to you. Thank you, Sohail, if you'll start us off.
Thank you so much, Harsha, for the introductions and for leading us and into these conversations. Thank you, folks who organized. Thank you, Rejan. I'm not going to repeat all the things that Harsha said. I'm just going to stop there. And what I wanted to share with folks today is a few things about double punishment and criminal inadmissibility, because it is my own situation that I'm facing. I'm facing deportation to so-called Morocco, but also I'm going to attempt to just share some of my thoughts on how I think about these processes, these racist processes, from, I guess, like a more general point of view that, as Harsha said, that is interconnected with like broader struggles towards decolonization and liberation and abolition. So, borders or our sites of our contentious sites where violence is deployed against the bodies of migrants for merely moving through the land, returning or leaving, and their movements is enforced, their bodies and minds are under attack by the carceral state that uses borders as or bordering or border enforcement as a way to do a lot of things. And folks who are present here today have written extensively about the role of borders within the global global regime of terror waged by nation states on people and on indigenous land around the world. And I just want to also, start the conversation by stating that clearly that for some of us, immigration law, and it is considered as an apartheid regime that is faced by migrants. So an apartheid regime that that exposes or that enforces a set of law on a particular group of people just because of these constructed identity, the state constructed identity that is highly, reliant on state thought, that is, and like challenging, challenging those laws, and challenges those laws is actually, an important anti-state, space, because at the end of the day, a lot of these problems against migrants that are like cultural and otherwise created in the world that puts us in precarious situations are, in fact, emanate from, state thought and racist state practices, right? So, one of them is, so immigration law, like criminal law and criminal law, even though like it applies to different people, different groups of people, differentially, like it discriminates against people based on their gender, their race, their class, etc., etc. But in theory, it is a law that is supposed to apply to everyone within the nation's borders, right? So, but immigration law, again, it applies to a group of people. So that's why, hence, like the consideration of apartheid. And it is only like an apartheid, regardless of what fashion it is deployed on people and beings and lands, condemns its systemic victim to a life of trauma, to exploitation, to fetters, to assassinations, and to the brute force and violence of the state. And Canada, so-called Canada, bars non-citizens for many reasons, right? So like some of them are race, so like we see that with like the Haitian migrants and other like Black folks who are like barred from the territory for merely being Black folks, right? And it bars them for health reasons, like Canada bars people for health reasons, for disability reasons, for criminality or so-called criminality, quote unquote, and for security reasons. So like people who, like, for example, engage in like human or international rights violations are barred from entering the territory, although so-called Canada engages in these human rights and international violations on a regular basis. They also bar people for, quote unquote, like criminality or criminalized acts, and that those categorization, like in my case, I have like one of them is called like serious criminality, right? So serious criminality is a category that basically means nothing. Like it means nothing. It means that you have been charged and found guilty of an indictable quote unquote offense because you offended the queen, even though she offended everyone on a daily basis by like literally like waging war and killing people off. So if you got found guilty of an quote unquote offense that is punishable by a maximum sentence of at least 10 years, you are found to be, or you're categorized under this category of serious criminality, And you know what? Like the charges that I was first initially deported for is trafficking crack cocaine. And then when you hear that, you're like, oh my God, like trafficking. Like I got caught with 0.5 grams of crack cocaine. I trafficked it, you know what I mean? And then that warranted a deportation. But guess what? Like it's not automatic because there is a certain like process that is a little bit like not clear in a way, because I was charged with that charge in 2000, like I was charged with it like in a year, and I was found guilty. I served my time, I got out. But next time I came to jail on a new set of charges, which was like gun charges and other charges, like most of them got dropped anyways. But like when I came in on those charges, like all of a sudden immigration came to see me in my cell. And that's what they do. When you hear that call from immigration, you start like a life of terror. You know what I mean? Like, of course, immigration before that, we were already terrorized as displaced people, as people who are moving through the land. People are already terrorized in various ways at the border, in hospitals, because the system is racist, in the school, at the workplace, in housing, we already have those things, right? But the thing is, when you have these criminal admissibility, when you have that meeting with them, when they come to you in your cell and they wake you up in the morning to drag you to the court, that takes 5 minutes, literally, the hearing takes 5 minutes, and it's basically like systematic, like you were charged and found guilty of this charge, and you did time for it, automatically you're gonna get, you get the deportation order, right? And I'll just go like, so I'll make it like a little bit more explicit and like more clear for folks. I'll go over like the text of the law in order for folks to like see what I'm trying to say. But like section 36, 1A of the Immigration and Refugee IRPA, it states that a permanent resident or a foreign national is inadmissible on grounds of serious criminality for having been convicted in Canada of an offense under an act of parliament punishable by a maximum term of imprisonment of at least 10 years, or an offense under an act of parliament for which a term of imprisonment of more than 6 months have been imposed. Okay, so that's another way that you're inadmissible on grounds of serious criminality. And section 36(2) of the act states that a foreign national is inadmissible on grounds of criminality for having been convicted in Canada of an offense under the act or of parliament, punishable by way of indictment, so an indictable offense versus like a summary offense, which are like less worse in law, or two offenses under an act of parliament not arising out of a single occurrences. So even if you are found guilty of two summary quote unquote offenses, they can consider them as indictable offenses if you have two instances. I have so many instances on my criminal record. The police been targeting me and like targets people like all the time in the streets. You know what I mean? For various reasons. So do you think we're going to have like short criminal records? Like we're going to have like summary offenses on summary offenses, and like lawyers don't help us when we are younger, because like they push us through the plea factory of the courts, you know, they make us, they make us plead guilty to charges that like maybe if we were white and if we had resources, if we were like from a different class, we would have had like a chance to fight them in court. But, all these things, it sets us up for failure. This system, it is created in order to, in order to work in conjuncture with the other, colonial systems that the Canadian state has in place in order to further other people, to other some people, and create these categories that like is going to like sometimes folks in the migrant justice would say, on like anti-racism would say, they would pit us together against each other and stuff. But in reality, these laws are fake, these borders are fake, but the suffering that people are living is real, and the increase, like, for example, like even like folks here are going to maybe speak on that, I'm sure. Like surveillance technology, when it comes to like ankle bracelets, like doesn't mean that I'm outside right now, that I'm outside of prison. And imagine, this is not only me, there is like a lot of people who are in my situation. And it doesn't mean that when we have a ankle bracelet that life is easier because we're outside. Look at me, I don't even have an ankle bracelet. And I was arrested on December 31st by CBSA and the Ottawa police, for no reason. They worked together. They colluded and they arrested me just for being like vocal and organizing against them, because I don't think that they're legitimate systems that should rule over the life of people. I think no one should rule over people, and I think that these systems must be destroyed because of first of all, the reasons why they were invented, and the consequences, the human consequences that they have on people, like we didn't have, like some of us, like we have to go sign in into, just please let me know the time when I'm getting close. But some of us like basically like would have to go sign in at immigration every week. I have to go sign in every week at CBSA offices on it, you know what I mean? And that I experienced that as punishment, as control. Like, I want to do something else on a Monday morning instead of going to CBSA. When I came out, I didn't have a work permit, and a lot of people who come out of detention don't have a work permit. I actually just met another person there when I went to sign in like last time, and we had a chat, and yeah, he, the person, like he's forced to come to CBSA to sign in, even that he's not able to have employment, They force you to buy bus tickets, to take Ubers, whatever means you're going to take to come there. It's pretty far. I know I spoke to someone else a few days ago. He's released further even than all of us. Like he got released out, like almost outside of Ottawa. Ottawa is as big as like Vancouver, Edmonton, Calgary, and Toronto and Montreal combined, like the area, you know what I mean? Just because of the amalgamation, it's very big and it's very empty. This person is in Ottawa, but is like super far, and he has to come all the way from that. It takes him like, I think like 4 hours commute to get to the CBSA appointment. You know what I mean? And And when you go there, sometimes you go in a room when they want to talk to you, and the room automatically closes behind you. You know what I mean? The room automatically closes, because that's like is detention, right? And like, for example, like when I was arrested, I experienced my own home as being segregation. You know, I was in my house, and like I experienced it as being like a form of segregation, because I was by myself. The convoy, you know, people was outside, you know, protesting for 3 weeks, but they let them protest for 3 weeks, and us, we want to protest against, and they arrest us even before we do anything. You know what I mean? And so it's a sad situation for migrants, and especially for migrants who are criminalized, because migration is already a hard thing, you know, to deal with for, you know, in general, right? So there is like, it's gendered, you know, it's like cis heteropatriarchal, it's like carceral in many ways. It's, you know, it's just like oppressive in many ways, many layers, you know, but when you're criminalized, you're pushed further through that process, you know, you have less, you know, you have less guarantees, or like less protections, even though like I wouldn't call them that. Like, for example, you don't have the right to appeal if you served more than 6 months, you know, you don't have the, you know, you're surveilled in community. Look what happened with CBSA, like you're surveilled by them sometimes. They even like keep tabs on like who comes in your house, and if you live there, that address, you know. If you choose to like sign in by phone, you have to like surrender your voice, like your voice to them in some ways, like, you know, record your voice, and they're gonna have like these records of them, and they're gonna keep tracking you across borders. And like what's going on to immigrants is bad, but for criminalized folks it's even worse. Um, and we face increased risk of arrest and taken and deportation, just because, you know, we engage in, you know, and on top of that, like I'm going to bring another point, is that like with double punishment, like we already served our time, you know. Even if we are going to think within, you know, these state categories or state thought, like do the time, do the crime, we already did our time, you know, like other nationals, you know. But because we are foreign nationals, we are double punished. But this also just, again, like I'm gonna trying to say it eloquently this time, but again, these processes that I'm suffering from, and then many people who are in my situation, or who are stateless and facing deportation, or who are like actually facing domestic violence and gender-based violence, where they're getting deported, and this, these are part of like very serious processes of violence and apartheid and against our communities. So they have to be like taken for the seriousness that they are, because, and we have people have to do everything in their, you know, in their possible to dismantle them. People who know about these things, who learn about them, they have to be in solidarity with people challenging deportations, challenging these ministries, like going to the Ministry of Immigration, whatever event they have, like crashing it, like raising awareness that borders are fake, you know, and like and keep, you know, putting the word out there, but getting organized in order to support people, to support their campaigns, to try to mobilize some funds, to try to get people supported and such, and support folks who are already doing this work, like you know, the groups, for example, like Solidarity Across Borders and others who are already doing this work. And yeah, like please be there for us, because this violence has to stop. You know, people must stop being dehumanized just because they're moving through land, and most often they are like forced and displaced people moving through land, and you know, doesn't make sense to me, and it has to stop. And I hope that I see that during my lifetime, because more and more people know about these things because of the work of folks who are like around this table here today, and probably folks who are listening, and others, and like migrants who are putting their their life on the line. So I have hope, but also like I can have no hope without mobilization. Like people have to actually like, you know, show up and be there in the streets when is needed.
Sohail, thank you so much. Thank you so much for always your brilliance, your compassion, and sharing so much of your life with all of us, and for inspiring us across these lands. to mobilize. As you said, there is no hope without mobilization, and how necessary that on the ground struggle is, and for making all the connections that you did so clearly, that you and so many others are enduring. And for people who are listening in who are unfamiliar, I just really want to encourage you to please check out the Keep Sohail Home campaign. There are so many who are standing with and alongside Sohail. Sohail means so much to us. So please check out that campaign, support it wherever you are, whether you're in so-called Ottawa or not. There are many ways to plug in. And I really want to just read out a little bit from the Keep Sohail campaign, to echo what Sohail has already said. And the Keep Sohail campaign is part of the broader fight against the systemic racism and violence that is embedded within both the criminal legal system and immigration system. Refusing double punishment is a refusal of the anti-Black and classist divisions between good, deserving, and so-called bad, undeserving immigrants, the latter of whom are overwhelmingly subjected to poverty, profiling, isolation, and dehumanization. It is a rejection of the violent borders that divide, contain, and control Indigenous lands and peoples, and we stand in solidarity with Indigenous nations fighting for decolonization and land back. And so please join the campaign. Sohail, in order to keep Sohail home, Sohail is so loved. We need them to stay here. They have a right to stay here. They deserve to stay here and deserve safety, as do every single people on these lands who are facing this unjust system. And also for people who are interested, please check out the work of MRN, Migrant Rights Network. Yesterday, there was marches and protests across these lands to commemorate March 21st as part of the struggle for migrant justice. So also check out their work too. Yes, and they had actions in Jamaica too, particularly with migrant workers who, as we know, are living in so many different places at one time as a result of borders. And so please check out that and so many of the other organizations that Sohail mentioned. And Sohail, again, thank you so much. We're just so honored that you spend time in this struggle and that you continue to inspire and bring so much strength and hope and ferocity to our movements and making all of the connections that you do. Yes. I will turn it over to Petra next.
Thank you so much, Harsha, and thank you to all of you for the opportunity to be here with you for this space of hopefully co-learning and undoing some of the really violent systems that we're all trying to fight against. I really appreciated, Sohail, your experiences that you shared, and I wanted to pick up on a few of the tendrils that you mentioned, particularly the impacts of surveillance and new technologies and the way that they're changing and yet also reifying the vast power differentials that we are all trying to struggle against when it comes to the violent border regimes. I wanted to share some photos from my work just so that it's a little bit more interesting than just me speaking. And I also want to just note, the photos that I'm sharing are mostly of kind of background views, and if there are people that are captured in there, I don't show any faces because it's part of a policy that I've really done a lot of learning from my colleague, Kenya J. Pinto, who I believe is listening in on today. We don't ever want to capture someone in a situation of great difficulty and then plaster their images in this kind of poverty porn paradigm that unfortunately is very, very common in the space of human rights advocacy and humanitarianism as well. But really, I wanted to also start and zoom out and somehow also address the situation that is happening at the Ukrainian borders, because it felt like I couldn't really make my remarks without somehow situating it in the current reality. I just actually returned from doing a bit of a fact-finding scoping trip to 3 border regions that border with the territory of Ukraine currently. And it's a really complicated thing to reflect on, particularly so close to being there and witnessing a lot of the complications, but I think it actually presents an opportunity to situate some of my other remarks. Because really what we're talking about is a system of immense solidarity and really, really moving acts of humanity that I think are important to recognize. And I know that in the Canadian media, this has been covered as well. But unfortunately, and of course, this will not be a surprise to those of you tuning in and to my esteemed friends and colleagues who join me here today. Unfortunately, the kind of solidarity and then the kindness and softness and compassion that we've been seeing has also been marked with great differentials of experience, particularly for people of color and racialized communities, including the Roma community that has been fleeing the violence in Ukraine. So again, what's really difficult is I think we need to find ways to hold space both for the kindness and compassion in this ongoing situation, while also calling out the systemic racism, violence, and discrimination that once again we are seeing at the edges of Fortress Europe. And just, Poland, for example, is a great case study where you see all this amazing organizing and solidarity at the Polish-Ukrainian border space, and yet few hours north is the Polish-Belarusian frontier, where people continue to be held in inhumane conditions, pushed back into Belarusian territory, and just it's even impossible to do any human rights monitoring there. I did want to share this image as well. This is Calvin. He's a medical student from Western Nigeria, and I have permission to share this photo with you. He still has keys to his flat in Ukraine in his pocket, and I met him in a train station in Hungary. I think for me, it's just such a moving snapshot of just the violence that is ongoing, but also just the violence of bordering and the arbitrary bordering that we are all trying to struggle against. But really, what I want to do is just zoom out a bit and talk about some of the work that I've been engaged in over the last few years in trying to understand the ways that borders are changing and the ways that new technologies are making the border regimes even sharper and more difficult. Before the Ukraine situation developed, I was actually at the US-Mexico border, trying to, again, understand the ways that surveillance and new technologies are being deployed there. But I think what's important is when trying to understand the impact of the various migration management so-called technologies, we're talking about things like AI, lie detectors, surveillance drones, all sorts of automated decision-making that's making its way into immigration, refugee processing, some of the technologies that Sohail mentioned, surveillance tracking for immigration detention purposes. Again, none of these occur in a vacuum. It's really important to think about the broader ecosystem in which these technologies develop and are deployed, because it's an ecosystem that is replete with the criminalization of movement, anti-migrant sentiments, and really, really violent, deadly practices, such as pushbacks along frontier Europe, and also, of course, similar practices at the US-Mexico frontier. But what's really striking, when I was at in the Sonora Desert Corridor with some colleagues not too long ago, we really witnessed just the kind of visceral surveillance apparatus that is dotted throughout the Sonora Corridor. Here, for example, we're seeing a surveillance tower, and it's an experiment that has been kind of ongoing for many years now. But these AI-powered towers essentially sweep the frontier and the desert corridor. And it's actually been even moving further into more dystopian territory. When I was in the Sonora corridor, it was actually announced by the Department of Homeland Security that robo-dogs, which you see now here, are going to be deployed along the border. I mean, these are those horrible machines that have kind of been making rounds in the tech space, where essentially it's a military grade piece of technology that is now going to be used for border enforcement. But again, I want to bring it back to real impact here, because sometimes technology can seem very, theoretical and something kind of on the margins of what we're talking about. Because the future isn't just more technology, it is more death. Thousands of people have already perished making dangerous crossings for safety and to be able to exercise their freedom of movement. Like Mr. Alvarado, who is a young husband and father from Central America, whose memorial site we visited here. Because indeed, surveillance technologies and smart borders and whatever you want to call it have been proven to not, in fact, deter people from making dangerous crossings. Instead, people are forced to change their routes towards even less inhabited terrain, leading to loss of life both at the US-Mexico desert, but also along the maritime borders that border Fortress Europe. And really, if these technological experiments continue in the not so distant future, people like Mr. Alvarado will be pursued by high-speed military-grade technology that's designed to kill. I also like to include this photo because it shows the arbitrariness of walls and bordering. I mean, this is essentially between land that is considered US and Mexico, and the wall just ends and you can hop over and all of a sudden find yourself in another territory altogether. Arbitrariness of walls is something that unfortunately is really replete around the world. And to me, this just was a very visceral example of that. But also, of course, the US-Mexico corridor is not the only region where violent border technologies are being deployed. For the last 2 years almost, I've been based in Greece and have been documenting the rise of these new prison-like refugee camps on the Aegean Islands, the ones that are kind of between Greece and Turkey, which is again part of this increasing virtual fortress Europe, such as the island of Kos, which you're seeing here. And for me, one of the most moving experiences I had was with a conversation with a young mother from Afghanistan on the eve of her family being forcibly transferred into one of these prison camps on the island of Samos this past September. When we were chatting, she hurriedly typed out this message to me and essentially says, if we go there to this prison camp, we will go crazy. And it's not hard to imagine why, because this is what the camps look like. They are surrounded by layers of barbed wire. They include algorithmic motion detection, risk detection surveillance, fingerprint scanning, and even actual virtual reality technology that is being tested out to monitor people who are living inside. So again, I think what's important is that it's not just about the technology, it's not about the kind of physicality, but it's about the kind of symbolic violence that's inherent in the kind of development and deployment of these experiments. Because in the opaque and discretionary world of border enforcement and immigration decision-making, structures which of course are underpinned by systemic racism and historical discrimination against people migrating, technology really just reifies these vast power differentials that are already inherent in these violent border regimes. I mean, for example, we know that facial recognition, there's huge appetite for facial recognition technology at and around the border, is highly discriminatory against Black and brown and racialized faces. And that algorithmic decision-making often relies on biased data sets, which then render biased results. For me, a great example is those AI lie detectors that I mentioned. That is a class of technologies that is being currently experimented on, where essentially an AI type system will use facial and emotion recognition technology to purportedly tell an officer whether someone is lying at the border. But how can an AI lie detector deal with differences in cross-cultural communication and someone, for example, not making eye contact in the way that we are used to, or even just because they're nervous? Or what about the impact of trauma on memory and the fact that we know that we don't tell stories in a linear way anyways? Human decision makers in this violent system already have issues with these complex factors. But really, just to wrap up, at the end of the day, it's not really about the technology, is it? It's about broader questions as well. Questions around which communities get to participate in conversations around proposed innovation, and which groups of people become testing grounds for violent border tech experiments. And again, why does the private sector get to time and again determine what we innovate on and why, often in really, really problematic public-private partnerships where states are super keen to introduce this technology and then over-rely on the private sector in this so-called AI arms race that some people have been calling it. I mean, it's really clear, right? Whose priorities matter when we choose to create violent technologies and AI-powered lie detectors to be used against people on the move instead of using AI to root out racist border guards? There's a clear priority setting there. And in my work, based on years now of on-the-ground research and hundreds of conversations with people who are themselves at the sharpest edges of technology, it's clear that the current lack of conversation around how to govern and regulate this technology creates this kind of laboratory for high-risk experiments, making people on the move a testing ground for violent technology. Because technology is never neutral. It's a political exercise, which highlights again how this allure of quick fixes and the hubris of innovation doesn't address the systemic and historical reasons why people are marginalized and why they're forced to migrate in the first place. I'll leave it there. Thank you so much for the opportunity to share a bit about my work, and I really look forward to the conversation that we will hopefully have today.
Petra, thank you so much for that. Thank you for laying that out and really highlighting the ways in which surveillance in tech is not neutral, and the ways in which it's just amplifying policing power and the power of border imperialism and border technologies. And I just wanted to put out there for folks who are interested, there's a really amazing multimedia resource that just came out in the United States. It's abolishdatacrim.org. It's really accessible. I have a hard time with tech stuff, but it's such a key part of how policing power is expanding. And so this is a very accessible way to learn it. It's got infographics, visuals, et cetera. It's really quite US based, but it really looks at the kind of interlocked machineries of migrant surveillance and these kind of processes of data criminalization, which Petra laid out so clearly. Again, that website is abolish.datacrim.org, and it's a great way to kind of look at the ways in which the carcerality of borders and prisons are expanding through the use of surveillance. Thank you so much, Petra, for being here and also for all your work, and just wishing you safety to you and your team at this time in Fortress Europe in particular. And I will now turn it over to Todd.
Hello, thanks so much, Harsha. It's really an honor and to be on this panel with you and Sohail and Petra. And so it's hopefully I can add to what everyone else has spoken to a little bit, but I'm not sure I can, but I'll try. One thing that comes to mind when I'm thinking about the whole border system and the global border is I went to the Maasai region in southern Kenya, and I took a trip to the border with some Maasai people who drove me to the border, and the border was basically the border between Kenya and Tanzania, and the border was basically a monument. That's what it was. And I remember, like, I had just got back. I went to Kenya from Israel Palestine, and the massive border fortification that's going on in Palestine, around Palestine. I was in the West Bank, and I was like, I remember like comparing that to the monument. And of course, I live in the US-Mexico borderlands, and used to seeing the kind of massive fortification of the border. So and so I went and I talked to a Maasai elder a little bit later, and he told me, he said this is an egregious human rights violation, the just the border being there at all, right? And first of all, he said, my mother lives on the other side of the border in Tanzania, so I've had to struggle with that my entire life. And then second, he told me that that it divided the Maasai people, and the border itself was not drawn by the Maasai. The border was drawn at the 1883 Berlin Conference in Europe, and as was the rest of the continent of Africa. And so this has the direct correlations of what happened in Berlin. When I interviewed the elder, his name was Maynard, in a couple of years ago, the colonial nature, the violent colonial nature of the border and how it was formed was very, very much present in that moment. And that sort of thing just seemed to, it's everywhere. I was there, but I remember when I was on the Jordanian Syrian border, and I was talking to a man there, and Jordan had closed its border with Syria for a couple of years, just completely closed it. And I asked him, this was like a couple of years ago, I think it was 2017. And I asked him what he thought about that. And he said, I hate it, immediately. My grandmother is on the other side of the border. Like everywhere you go, somebody's grandmother or somebody's relative or community, the borders themselves divide right through communities everywhere across the world. And of course, the Tonatam nation, the Tonatam people, that's where I live. This is Tucson is Tonatam traditional land. And when the border surveyors came to draw the so-called U.S.-Mexico border in the mid-19th century. There's a story that there was a Tohono elder who saw the surveyor, like a group of, I think it was a group of soldiers and surveyors who were drawing this line right through Tohono territory, and he went out there and he started pointing and said, "Do you not know that Tohono people live hundreds of miles?" I mean, he didn't say it this way, of course, but hundreds of miles to the south of here, which is well into what is now known as Mexico, hundreds of miles to the north, like pointing in all directions. So the line, without any sort of consultation of the people that actually live there, was just bisected the Tohono territory. And I bet, if you could go back and talk to that Tohono elder who was talking to the surveyors, what has happened since then is just completely unimaginable. But yet, fast forward 150 years and here we are, and I have a map like right to my left, which depicts the world as color-coded nation states, where like the world, you look at the world and these boundaries that have been drawn by the Berlin conferences in whatever way that they've manifested in different places are the way that I'm supposed to see the world, or we're all supposed to see the world, and let alone like where the peoples of the world are coming from, or where the great mountain ranges are, or where the great rivers are, or where anything is. It's with the whole kind of focus is this, let's look at the world in this particular way. And then here where I live in the United States, right, the whole idea of the border, it's become, doesn't matter who you are, and I'm speaking in terms of Washington. It doesn't matter who you are. Borders, the idea of border, quote unquote, security is something you cannot question. You have to have it. You can't say it becomes sacrosanct. And then it's like, doesn't matter who's president. It gets attention when certain people are president, but when others are president, the tension goes away. But the same sort of massive, very violent border fortification is still happening. And that's the thing. You go, okay, so border, like the word border, the term border security, it's when you look at it from the perspective of the Tohono elder, and the kind of surveyors drawing this line that was never, with the people that actually live there were not consulted. It's nonsensical, the actual, the idea of this border. But yet we're told that there's no other way to envision the world, and this sort of rhetoric of security, the security rhetoric is just, I think it's one of the most mind-numbing things that you could possibly do, because how could you possibly think of what's going on as quote unquote border security after listening to what Sohail was saying, for example? It's designed, or in Petra too, it's designed, the infrastructure is designed to inflict violence upon people, right? And the way that it's set up in the Sonoran Desert, and we go back to Petra's photographs, it's designed to make people go into the desert, so they're the most quote unquote insecure as they possibly can. So the idea of security is completely, I mean, charitably completely inaccurate. But it's, and then you think of, well, let's think of the Tohono people, where like the people that live on the border, you cannot travel off the Tohono reservation, which is just to the south where I live in Tucson, without going through a checkpoint. And it's become so many people have been harassed, including children, that they have a new term called checkpoint trauma, for going through the checkpoint. Or like, I remember I went to a meeting where on the Tohono Nation, where they were talking about the border, and there was about 100 people there, and they were asked, how many people have felt harassed by the Border Patrol? 100 hands. Every single person raised their hand, whether it be people who are tailgated or had spotlights go on them while they were driving, to actually people being pulled out of their car, being pepper sprayed, being beaten, there's incidents of people being shot and run over, There's incidents of home invasions, et cetera, et cetera. So what the hell do we mean by security? What is border security, right? And then when you turn to it and you look to it and you think about it, it's not security for anyone that lives in the border or crossing the border. It's security for something else entirely. And as Harsha said, and Harsha has written about very profoundly, like I'm the security is for what border imperialism, right? The security is for, from the U.S. point of view, that the United States can go around the world and do whatever the hell it wants and ransack places and go in different places and bomb, send its military into places, or cause immense ecological destruction if we want to think about the climate, and the sort of following displacement or dispossession of people is then managed in this massive border apparatus. And when bringing up the border apparatus, I've been focusing a lot on the US-Mexico border, but of course in the terms of the US or the European Union, there's a whole thrust of externalization, of moving the border far away from the actual boundaries of the particular nation state. So when you look at all this stuff, like I would say, comparing it to the elder and the nonsensical, you look at it and it's not, I mean, the whole thing is complete. I mean, my point is, I don't see how we can look at this honestly and unpack it and look at all the money that's gone into it and look at what the causes, impacts, and say, why there should be any questions of why we should be talking about this and bringing up, actively talking about dismantling it and ending it completely and thinking about something new. And I just wanted to end these remarks with going back to Kenya. When I was talking to the Maasai, a lot of there was just very interesting commentary, because I was asking them a lot about borders and the border and the Tanzania border. And many of the people that I talked to talked about what they said were movable borders or negotiated borders, meaning like not borders like that were inflicted upon them in a colonial process, like these stationary, static borders that impose a power dynamic, rather than that borders are always like, okay, you negotiate with people on an even playing field, and not just people. They always stress on the living earth, right? They have this great story about a place where an elephant was kept barging into a place where a number of people were living, and they said, okay, at night to eat from the trees, and then they said, okay, are we, like, what's going on with the elephant? And the way that they figured it out, that the elephant had a newborn, and and the elephant itself was not going to leave and was going to keep doing this. So in that way, that was, they negotiated this boundary, opened up the place so the elephant could come in and eat at night, and then until the newborn had grown and that the elephant could move on to someplace else. So that's just an example of this whole idea that of what we think of these borders as these static things that are unquestioned, and they really, there's so many ways to go about it and so many ways to think of it, and I'll just end saying that, in terms of abolition, I think that's sincerely the direction where we need to go.
Thank you, Todd. Thank you for sharing that insight and some of your work. And listening to you talk about the border region and the Odom resistance to it, such a big part of those connections that you were talking about in terms of militarization and, just the corporate profiteering, the capitalist profiteering. I'm reminded, for folks who are unfamiliar, that, Elbit, who is an Israeli security company, one of the world's largest security companies, is been on contract to make surveillance towers in Odom territory. So we see those connections in terms of border militarization and surveillance, and these apartheid regimes that circulate and move. And also for people who are interested, the ODM continue to struggle against the border. I believe it was a year or two ago that they put out a really moving video that was called "There's No ODM Word for a Wall," that really highlights the resistance that the ODM are leading against border militarization in their territories across the so-called US-Mexico border. So I'd encourage people to check that out. And the last thing that I'm reminded of hearing you talk, Todd, all of you, but particularly as you're talking about, whose security and what security, is a quote by Aisha Siddiqui, who wrote, "Every border implies the violence of its maintenance." Every border implies the violence of its maintenance, right? Which really forces us to dismantle and unravel the concept of the borders as we know them today. So thank you all so much for this conversation. I'm going to encourage folks who are listening in. I think I've just figured out, because we're live streaming at the same time, that I can get questions from the chat. So if you are watching the live stream on the YouTube, please drop in any questions or comments that you have for Sohail, Petra, and Todd. I'll gather them up in 5-10 minutes. And while you are thinking on some questions and some comments, please do drop them in. We'd love to hear from you. I'm going to ask you all some questions. So I'll start with Sohail. Sohail, thank you, again, for everything that you laid out, particularly the convergence between criminalization and illegalization as you experience it, and as communities and comrades that you're all alongside experience it. And listening to you speak, listening to all you speak is, sparking so many thoughts. But, one of the things I'm reminded of is a piece that Angela Davis and Gina Dent wrote, who are Black feminist abolitionists in the United States. And they wrote about the prison as a border. And they have a piece where they talk about how the prison is a border. And, so much of the work that you do is thinking about the prison and the border as part of these same systems as you experience. Can you talk us through a little bit more about how you imagine, or how you experience this connection and synergy between the border and the prison, and the kind of prison to deportation pipeline that you have been struggling against and organizing against, and talking about double punishment for those of us who are still learning? If you can walk us through that a bit more in terms of those connections and how embedded they are.
Yeah, thank you very much, Harsha, for that question. When you asked me that question, my mind thought about this conversation I had with someone, and we were talking, and they asked me, when did you start learning about deportation and stuff? And for a second, I thought I forgot exactly where I started learning about people getting deported, right? But then I thought about it for a second, and I started thinking that in my community, in the community of for example, the youth that I used to hang out with, and even older people that I used to hang out with and stuff like that, I started remembering slowly all the people that started disappearing from our communities getting deported, you know what I mean? People from so-called Morocco, my friends from Somalia, people from Iraq, you know what I mean? Here in Ottawa, there's a lot of folks from these areas, Iraq, Somalia, there's a lot of deportations there, Jamaica. And then I started thinking about all my friends that were in the jail. We used to be together, sometimes cellmates, and some of them used to be under deportation. And they used to tell me hey, Sohail, when you go out, don't do this, don't come back, we just counsel each other, don't come back to jail, look at us, And some of them were refugees. They came here at the age of 3 years old from Somalia, and they were in their late 20s or even early 30s sometimes when these things were happening, So they came here young. And so basically we learn about these things, us, as we see them happen to the people around us, because it happens too much. But then you don't think about them in terms of as in terms of oppressions. You do, but then you don't have the means to think that you are the one who is being wronged in that situations a lot. Yes, you feel it, you experience it, but you don't have the language to talk about it, you know what I mean? And then you just go about the process, and then you go outside and you engage. It's a vicious cycle. So for us, like learning about these things and making the connections really like happens like by like seeing the people around you getting deported, but then like afterwards when you read like folks like you Harsha and like other folks, like when you encountered, I saw Petra at a conference before and I was able to like hear from them, and like we hear from folks and stuff, and like that experience it that brings some like radical views on interpretations of our reality, and beyond the internalized, and vicious state thought that has been imposed on us, and like when you start like thinking about like the gender, for example, dimensions of it, if you're able to get there and like think about like, for example, all the trans folks and like women and like other gender oppressed folks who are displaced, and like the experiences they experience in refugee camps, for example, and the violence that they experience in different spaces, so that thing starts opening your mind into learning about these processes. And then like when you learn that actually like the border is a figment of imagination, like these things, like for colonized people, we know that, like our countries, like so-called countries, they're literally like Todd was saying, they were like drawn somewhere else, right? And like there was comments, like there was some like, sorry, like bullshit comments online about like how like we were like, oh, these borders, we decided to keep them because we didn't want to fight over them, because if we fought over them, like someone in the UN was saying that from Africa. And I was like, no, these borders, we did actually, we should destroy them back there too, because there is indigenous people in Morocco. There is, the Western Sahara, who's colonized by the Moroccan state. There's people in the reef. There is people. So like when you kind of like learn about them, you make the connections. You're like, oh my God, yeah, this is what's happening. Okay, fuck that, Yeah. Is that like a little bit, what answers a little bit the question?
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Sohail. And thank you also for the reminder, right? That that migrant and non-status and refugee communities are also all amongst us, right? Because that violence and silencing and isolation is such a big part of it, that, as you mentioned, the ways in which people literally disappear from our communities for many reasons, but also the violence of the border is such a key part of that. And literally every single person who's listening in or who may listen in the future, we guarantee you that somebody who is affected by borders, who is facing deportation or is living with precarious status, whether or not you know that, the person pumping your gas, the person in the grocery store, the person picking your food. It's such a key part of how we are bound up in these violences, but it's, deliberately made invisible, which we know is part of what carcerality is meant to do, right? Disappear human beings in different ways. And so thank you also for that reminder. I don't know if you intended it, but please, Sohail, go ahead.
And make them visible, very visible in other ways,
Absolutely. Yeah. And make that reality and struggle visible. Thank you, Sohail. Yeah. And thank you for laying that out again so clearly around, what this means in people's lives and by extension, our lives, right? This is part of our life too, and part of what we're implicated in. Petra, you do a lot of work on surveillance and you've been talking about it. I would love to hear your thoughts on, and I think this is by extension to broader abolitionist struggles too, right? Not just the border, but we're seeing, as you noted, these are military technologies. Policing is increasingly relying on technological surveillance as a method. How do we, in the context of, for example, defund movements, where we're looking at things like, budgets and boots on the ground, and same with the border, expansion of detention centers. And Sohail, and you pointed out, anklet bracelets increasingly being used as a so-called alternative to detention, which may make it seem like detention is shrinking, but in fact it's not. You're just you're literally bordering your body. How do we fight back against surveillance and these kind of newer carceral technologies within abolitionist movements, given how they're kind of reconfiguring power? How do we as movements adapt to those reconfigurations?
That's such a good question, Harsha. And I mean, it's something that keeps me up at night, because I think it can be very overwhelming to try and get a handle on all the stuff that's happening, particularly when we're talking about new tech, surveillance, this kind of obfuscation of power in the space. And it's designed that way, right? It's designed to make it difficult to critique, particularly, I think, by movement, by organizing groups, by folks who are affected, because that's really the project, is to make the kind of violence even more ephemeral. Oftentimes, when I'm doing on the ground work, one of the things that I'm trying to do is just even capture the impacts of what's happening. And that's very hard because, again, these technologies are designed to not be seen. They are designed to shift the border, so space, even more from the kind of physical location that we're all, at least we can imagine, to something completely different. So then, as you say, how do we fight against this? How do we call it out? How do we make space for resistance and for abolition, not only of the border regime, but also of the technology itself? I mean, I think one way and starting point is to learn as much as we can from each other, from people who understand, the kind of political economy of the border industrial complex, people who are tracking the private sector companies that you mentioned. A lot of them are Israeli, a lot of them are tested out in the West Bank. I mean, these are all actors that we know about, but it's about creating a community of knowledge sharing and knowledge production on these issues. And also, funding is a huge part of this, because vast amounts of money flow into, again, this border industrial complex that is increasingly on the rise. Not surprising, but I think that is a way that we really need to start organizing on. I mean, there's some amazing groups already, Mi Gente, for example, Just Futures Law, other colleagues, in the US space and the Border Violence Monitoring Network in the EU that are trying to do some work on this. But again, I think because the surveillance tech side of things is perhaps still somewhat new, and again, if you're dealing with, let's say, a deportation order for tomorrow, you're not necessarily thinking about drones and ankle bracelets, but we need to think about it from a more holistic perspective and learn from one another. Apologies for the noise. I have a puppy who is extremely passionate about abolishing borders, so I will mute myself. Sorry.
It's all good. Thank you, Petra. And I know a lot of good work, Todd, that you're involved in through TNI, the Transnational Institute for people who are interested, do a lot of that mapping of the kind of, corporate border industrial complex and where money is flowing and how the private sector is implicated. And here, of course, with the caution that, private sector profiteering is part of the puzzle, but of course it's state violence ultimately as well, right? Because sometimes it can be easy to go into this arm of argument that we don't want private prisons, as if those state prisons are any better, which none of us are saying. I'm just saying it for our collective benefit, but it's so important to follow that money and to look also at, TNI has some really good research for people who are interested in the connection also between the weapons industry and the border industrial complex, just so many strands of thought there for people who want to follow that work. Todd, because you're involved with TNI, perhaps you can speak a bit more on that as well. But I also want to ask you a question if you want to answer one or both of them. So the first one around this, this connection to capitalist production and how it's related to the border industrial complex. And my second question is something that I'm deeply thoughtful about and constantly thinking about is the idea, we've heard about how borders are not just at the physical border, right? They're internalized, for example, through surveillance technologies, temporary foreign worker programs are forms of bordering. Sohail talking about all the ways in which we internalize borders, even once we're within the so-called nation state, like that trauma and the fear of deportation doesn't disappear just once you're, within the so-called national space. One of the things that I'm thoughtful about is increasingly border militarization is not just at the site of the border. It's increasingly being outsourced, right? So we know Fortress Europe is not just around Europe. It's increasingly in the Sohail region, Turkey, et cetera. Of course, in the North American context, increasingly outsourced to Mexico and Central America, Libya, we can go on and on. Can you talk, because you've done extensive work around what you call the externalization of borders and the empire of borders, one of your pieces of work, just how, again, in thinking about abolition, how we need to be looking not just at the site of the border, but these broader regimes of, where is bordering happening, if not just at the border?
Yeah, sure. Like for example, from the U.S. perspective, there's so much focus put on the U.S.-Mexico border, and rightfully so. Well, rightfully so in the sense that there should be a lot of focus, but that's just a fraction of what the U.S. border really is. I at this point, I'd probably make the argument that, well, first of all, I should say the U.S. Canadian border, there's been a ton of um, uh, focus on that, particularly post 9/11, not quite as much as the U.S. Mexico border, but there's been a significant increase of deployment of border patrol, the kind of and also, you know, the border patrol working with local police and state police and doing a lot of interior enforcement along the U.S.-Canada border and the so-called 100-mile zone in the United States. And also along those lines, the U.S. officials often refer to the third border, quote unquote third border, and that's the Caribbean, which is coming out of pretty much Puerto Rico, the west coast of Puerto Rico, Aguadilla, for people familiar. That's where the Department of Homeland Security and the CBP is located. And from there, they emanate, you know, across the Mona Passage, Dominican Republic, Haiti, and create like a kind of maritime border using many of the technologies that have been discussed in that area. And that's 1,000 miles away from the U.S. mainland. And the kind of cooperation, I guess you could put it, that the United States has had with Mexico, particularly over the last, I actually, you have to say this goes on for decades, but particularly in the last 10 years, in sending, well, there's been a lot of money that's been quote unquote invested in Mexico for Mexico to fortify its borders. And this is from the United States. And the United States has done what they call resource transfers, which then Mexico deploys on its southern border with Guatemala and Belize. And the United States has done trainings with Mexican immigration officials, Mexican immigration agents as well, and soldiers and police, and really has emphasized this fortification of the Mexican southern border with Guatemala, so much that Mexico is now deporting more people coming from Central America than the United States, which reversed a trend. And this happened in 2015. So meaning the trend reversed in 2015. So when you go into the papers of, you know, dig into the documents, the kind of externalization, or what the United States officials call extension of its borders, has become a huge part of its strategy. And this is why it's just so to look at the border, you know, just the bordering, to look at bordering, as I think Harsha put it, or the bordering regime that expands much, much further than, you know, the territory, and goes, I would say the front lines of the U.S. border are probably on the Mexico and the southern Mexico at this point. And I say southern Mexico because there's a whole checkpoint system that goes for hundreds and hundreds of miles in Mexico. So if you get through the border, which is actually not that difficult, because there's not necessarily a wall, or, you know, you can get through the border, but then to get past into the interior through the checkpoint system is really, really difficult. And it's almost like the exportation of prevention through deterrence. I mean, I could go on and on about this. I could go like Guatemala, Honduras. There's U.S. border programs going right down through the Western Hemisphere, through the Caribbean, between the Dominican Republic and Haiti. I was in Kenya because CBP, Customs and Border Protection, has an attaché in Nairobi, right? So you can go, Jordan, the same thing. And a lot of times they start tangling up with the European Union's externalization. Like you have U.S. programs going in Libya, and of course EU programs, Morocco, same thing. Algeria, the same thing. So you have, like, you start to see the EU and the US, and then Australia and Israel. You have all these countries that come that I would argue are forming this kind of global border regime, or I'm sure everyone is pretty much arguing it here since I've heard that term a number of times. But I'll leave it at that because I don't. Yeah, I'll just leave it at that.
Thank you for that, Todd. And if I may add, like, just how important that is for us to understand in terms of global politics, like oftentimes my experience is that migrant justice struggles or immigrant rights struggles gets very siloed into the so-called sphere of the local. But thinking about how borders travel and are outsourced and externalized, whatever we want to call it, is just a reminder of how global power circulates, right? And what imperialism at a global level looks like when these kinds of resource transfers are used, these kinds of, deeply colonial ways of ensuring that countries in the so-called global south, which is, a varied, it's not a singular place, of course, but with varied relationships of power, are implicated now in mass border violence. As you pointed out, Mexico now deporting more people back into Central America is something we have to think about and contend with in thinking about immigration politics at that global level. Thank you all so much. We have a few questions that have come in. The last question I'm gonna save for your closing comments because it's one of those heavy ones. So we'll take the one question. Then I also want to give you all an opportunity to riff off of each other. You probably have lots of things you want to share with each other, so I want to give you all an opportunity to do that. So we'll take the first question first. So these are from the same person and connected, so I'll read them out together. Can we discuss more how corporations such as Elbit, Spartan Corporation, or even producers of ankle bracelets are profiting off of the over-policing? And are there vested interests in over-policing and using marginalized populations to profit? Because of this, how much hope do we have that corporations can actually change their projections? What was that, Sohail? Was I unclear, or are you cutting off? Sohail, your sound is coming out unclear. Okay. Looks like Sohail's going to jump off and rejoin us. Someone else want to take that while Sohail rejoins?
I mean, I don't want to start off being extremely negative, but I mean, it's a really good question. And I think, again, it goes to the importance of looking at the kind of political economy that has grown up around the border complex. And I think the bottom line for private sector is that there is no incentive really to do anything differently, right? If anything, there's so much money to be gained in the militarization, in the border industrial complex, and the increased technology. It just becomes kind of part and parcel of almost this status quo. And so how do we actually undo that? How do we then talk about, sorry, we seem to be having all sorts of issues here. How do we talk about it from an abolitionist perspective if it's this system that's almost kind of baked in? I don't know. I don't have much hope. And also, I think with the kind of environmental element to all of this, it's only going to make things more difficult for the private sector to be disincentivized to, move away from this. I'd be curious to hear from Todd, though, because I know you've done a lot of work on the intersection between the environment and migration and border industrial complex as well.
Yeah, it's sure. That next week, actually, I'm going to this conference called the Border Security Expo, and it's this pretty big convention that happens on an annual basis in the U.S. where, like, at least a huge chunk of private industry comes in, and officials from DHS and border sheriffs, and when you're there, and I imagine this is what it's going to be like when I'm there next week. It's just like watching the industrial complex right before your eyes, right? Like you go in, you see the robo, I don't know if I'll see the robo dogs or not, but I assume I'll see something like that going into this convention center, and see all the biometrics and the different attempts at selling to, in this case, it'll be mainly DHS, but they bring in like people from officials, border guards from all over the world, who are looking to buy and sell. In the case of the United States, there's been 100 and recently did this calculation, so I have this on the top of my mind, but 105,000 contracts given by CBP and ICE between 2008 and 2020, worth about $55 billion or something like that. So there's been considerable emphasis put, or a lot of the there's a lot of contracting that's going on via CBP and ICE, and the projections I think like say a lot as well. Like the projections for the Homeland Security market, I think the latest one I saw was about $1 trillion, going up from 600 billion to $1 trillion by the mid 2020s or late 2020s. I can't remember exactly. And interestingly enough, to add that what you're asking, Petra, in these projections where they look at these market analysts look at, what is this market going to be worth? Now they're adding in climate stuff, like putting in, with climate catastrophe, we can see this is one of the things that's going to fuel this market or make it even, more and more. So in the forecast that I've looked at, I'm seeing that more often than not now, this kind of admission that further displacement around the world due to for whatever reason, like rising seas or desertification or all the different, things that people are dealing with in the rapidly changing climate is now being calculated into these border, increasing opportunities for companies to make money off in these border regimes.
Thanks, Todd. Sohail, do you want to see if your sound's working?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. I was just asking earlier. I didn't hear the question properly, but thank you so much for sharing that. My thought on that is that it's interesting to hear how much money is being invested in these technologies and stuff like that. While, for example, is the people who end up paying for them in a lot of instances. You know what I mean? For example, when in criminal, quote unquote, criminal court, you know what I mean? Bail systems. Yesterday when we were talking on the panel, one of the panelists pays $700 a month for the ankle monitor, right? And people actually pay hundreds of dollars a month to be monitored by the state. You know what I mean? And it actually the people who are concerned by it, it's basically you're paying for your prison cell. In a way, we do that in the pen too, because they take money for the cell itself. They take money from the little $50 that they give us every 2 weeks because we work. They take money for the cell, but people outside are also paying for those monitors, and it's just doesn't make sense, and also the nonprofit industrial complex is heavily involved into profiting from that too, because they literally have programs with the state. They work with CBSA and other agencies in order to promote these technologies and I guess expand the reach of the state into our communities.
Yeah, thank you all for so succinctly and perfectly tying that knot in terms of the circulation of capital, all the different players, and especially for highlighting the ways in which the nonprofit industrial complex gets implicated, because sometimes it's easier to target the large corporations, but they're the more insidious ways in which soft power, if that's what we want to call it, works, right? And this whole new industry of alternative to prison and alternative to detention that hugely implicates the nonprofit industrial complex and that whole network too, and that expanding web. So thank you all for highlighting that. We have about 6 minutes. So I'm going to give you the last question, but please, I really want to invite all of you to, while you're answering that question, also riff off of something someone else said. I know we haven't had as much time for that conversation, but we do have some time. So I'd love to hear something from all of you that you're thinking about what you've heard in this conversation. And the last question is a big one of those ones that we all want to ask each other, but we hate answering. Or maybe you don't hate answering. I'm projecting. So thank you all for your generosity and commitment in this cause. And I wonder, what are the ways in which each of you imagines a world that has abolished borders, cages, and walls? Just that small question.
I can go first. So the last question, we should answer the last question.
Yeah, answer the last question and or
Okay.
something you're thinking about in conversation with each other.
Oh, perfect. Yeah, okay. Yeah, well, like the first thing that is like when I hear from folks like you, Harsha, Petra, Todd, and like the folks who are like engaged in like research and other things, and then I'm like, like how much like does the world is gonna like how much like research does it gonna take, what I mean, like for the people to like realize that like enough is enough, and like move actually like towards like a world without borders and cages and stuff like that, because the harm is like widely documented. The culprits are like very much people like pointed at them, they're identified, and we are the people, and like these things are cannot be accepted, they're unacceptable, and what are we going to do about it? Are we going to stay complacent in face of these atrocious violence and like how these things are harming our communities? And like just to think about like a world without borders, what that does that mean? Well, for me, it just means that, for example, like communities who are can decide of like what is affecting them, negotiate with each other, talk to each other in ways that are decolonial. You know what I mean? Like not stuck into like no racial capitalist logics about thinking about the market or things. Like let's go back to the basics. Like let's see what people need, because the systems we have in place right now, they don't meet the needs of people, even the most basic needs, let alone like some people's needs to like just be in the world, thriving, like pursuing like what they like and stuff like that. We are molded by these universities into becoming like like lawyers and like other jobs like crowns and stuff like that, not undermining all the good work that lawyers do to save us sometimes from the state, like protect us a little bit from the state, but the thing is, like, we do all these fake things in the world and everything continues on going on. Like, why can we like sit down and talk to each other and say like this is enough, and people in their neighborhoods come and talk to each other and say like, yo, this is the violence that we are facing. We know that the police don't solve violence in our communities. If police solve violence, we'll have less cases of gender-based violence. You know what I mean? We'll have, look what happened during the pandemic. Everyone, like all the women and all the trans folks and everyone like started like the increased like gender-based violence in domestic cases like increase. We still have police. Why we have that? Because our education system is messed up. We have no housing. People living with intergenerational trauma. Indigenous land is being colonized. People don't have running water on reserves. All these things, you know what I mean? And we have all these things, and everyone seems to just go into like the like without any care into like a human like a world catastrophe. That like Todd is talking to us about people who are like projecting like the profit that they're gonna make out of the displacement of people. Is that acceptable? Like, can someone like tell me in what world that is acceptable? You know what I mean? Shouldn't make people enraged and like literally like go at these people with every ounce of like privilege or power that they have, because you know what, these profiteers and these people making of us and these dictators and authoritarian regime and imperialist, colonialist, racist, people and systems are doing to us. We should not accept it. Out of all this conversation, all what like people should not accept what is happening and should mobilize very seriously and like challenge power every time, all the time, and every day. Because at the end of the day, this is like human people who are like suffering, and the land is destroyed, and it's going to create like the worst thing that is coming. And people are warning us, and and there is research, there is everything backing all these things, but the essential is that like our well-being, and these systems we have in place is not guaranteeing that. So a world without police and prisons is a world where, I can talk to our neighbors, we can express love to each other, we can receive some, we don't harm each other at every instances, because like the alienation and everything that is happening under late stage capitalism and every stuff, and we are not able to solve problems. We have decreased capacity to like address our issues in our communities, and it fractures us and that because of the carceral state. So we have to like avoid that, and try to come together and to fight these things. When there's actions against police, it's an action against border. When there's actions against border, it's an action against police. When there's an action for affordable housing, it's an action against borders. If there is an action, as long as those messages and those actions keep the radical direction and not get watered down and co-opted by whatever things that we have going on in this moment that risk to co-opt our movements and our efforts. So yeah, and is the solution is in people. And people look at what happened with the truckers. Everyone, they came together. We should come together too, and show force and make these people scared, and show them, also educate people and make people afraid again, to make people afraid from us too, because we're always afraid living, but we don't want to make them afraid in a bad way. We just want to live, you know what I mean? We just want to afraid so they can keep stay away from us. But I'm just rambling, but I think a world without prison is just one where people are involved, and people are involved in their communities and figure out some solutions that are outside of the carceral state, because it is up to no one to figure out your own solutions. You have to figure out your own solutions, but you have to make sure that they are not carceral.
Sohail, thank you for laying that down so beautifully, and a reminder for all of us about keeping it real, our relationalities and revolution. And I hear Ruthie Wilson Gilmore speaking when I hear you talk about abolition as, when she says abolition is presence, and just everything you're saying, and importantly, all the work that you do to be present for folks in our communities, for our kin, our relatives, and to show up as comrades in struggle, right? That ultimately we have to fight. There's nothing short of a fight that will transform and dismantle all of this. So thank you so much for that imagination and that vision and laying that down. And I will turn it over to Petra and Todd for the last few minutes if you have any final closing thoughts.
Not much more to add, just to say thank you for creating this space today, and also just through the work that you all do in this important fight against really, really violent border regimes. I mean, for me, when I think about what a world could look like, I just hope that we get to a place that is kinder and softer, and one also that recognizes the vast complexity of human experience, and that we can hold each other in a way that makes sense, and that allows every person to kind of be able to live to their full potential. That's what I like to imagine. I don't know, we seem to be pretty far from that, but I am always heartened by folks like you, knowing that we are all working on this together. Thanks.
Appreciate your call to softness and kindness, especially in movement spaces, right? It can seem larger than that, but so much of that is that. Thank you. Todd.
Me too. I appreciate that. I really do. And I don't really have that much more to add. I think you both, Sohail and Petra, both pretty much nailed it. I just, it'd be lovely to see, an international movement, a cross-border movement, emerge. And one of the things I always think about with this global border regime is that the powers that be are afraid of that, right? And there's a lot more of us, I guess we could put it, than there are of them, right? Or if there's a lot more, that sort of, there's a reason why this is we're being, there's all these divisions put out through the world. So I think like that, just piggybacking on what both of you said so eloquently and beautifully, it would be nice to just see that and see how quickly it all just comes down. Thank you for everything. I really appreciate it. And it was an honor to be on this panel with everyone. And thanks.
Thank you all. Thank you, Sohail. Thank you, Todd. Thank you, Petra. Thank you, Ian, for bringing us together. Rajan for holding down tech, and to our captioners and everyone who's participating. This was such a generative and nourishing conversation. I'm so thankful to be in the space with all of you, and for just laying down so clearly the violences and also the necessity of struggle, and holding on to some hope within that. So thank you all, wishing you all a good afternoon. Keep watching Scholar Strike. The program continues, and until soon. Be well.